After more than 5 decades of armed conflict, another move towards peace, as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia lay down their weapons.
With this event, the FARC want to show to the country and to the world that we are closing a chapter in the history of our country and beginning to write another, that of peace.
I felt sad to hand over my rifle. I feel sad and at the same time relieved, because we're showing the country that we're doing what we said.
As part of Colombia's historic peace deal, the FARC was meant to hand over the weapons of its 7,000 members by May 30th. But the deadline was extended after FARC commanders complained about delays in building special camps to house demobilized fighters.
Serán 20 días adicionales para el desarme y 60 para la reincorporación. No es nada, nada. Para terminar bien 53 años de enfrentamiento y violencia fratricida.
By mid-June, the FARC had handed over 60% of its registered weapons and said it would be able to honour the deadline. But as FARC rebels disarm, there's concern they're making themselves an open target. Once disarmed, the FARC will become a legitimate political movement with seats in Colombia's Congress. That's angered many Colombians, including right-wing paramilitaries who have targeted the FARC in the past. As part of the controversial peace deal, 315 demobilized rebels will be trained by Colombia's National Protection Unit to be official, paid bodyguards. The FARC says this is necessary because they fear their members will be attacked like the Patriotic Union Party in the 1980s. The left-wing party was almost completely wiped out after dozens of its members were murdered. And the FARC says it only trusts its own people to give protection. But for many Colombians, rearming and training rebels who have only just given up their weapons is unthinkable and isn't a commitment to peace at all. Will the FARC meet its disarmament deadline? And will it be the beginning of the peace Colombians have been promised? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, let's speak to Darrenel Rodriguez-Torres, who joins me from New York. He's the Executive Director of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. And from Bogotá, André Gómez Suárez, Director of Rodimos El Diálogo, an initiative supporting Colombia's peace negotiations. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Darrenel, if I can begin with you, what is the biggest hindrance to disarmament?
The biggest hindrance to disarmament? Well, the disarmament process has been going on with some small delays, but I think very minor. No, like it was showed in the document that you just aired. There is a 20-day delay into the whole disarmament process. This is a very complex process of disarmament. It's perhaps one of the most technically competent processes with international verification of the UN. So despite the delays, I'd say the process of disarmament is in good track.
Andre, are you happy with how President Santos has managed this process?
Yeah, I think President Santos has shown an incredible amount of leadership. This is a very complex process. 53 years of war divides a society. And I think we needed someone like President Santos to try to honor the agreement that he reached with the FARC in November last year.
And given, Andre, that the voters didn't want this, and it was just by a hair's breadth, it was 50.2%, given that the voters didn't want this, he still went ahead, and they still have all these problems where you have right-wing paramilitaries attacking the FARC themselves, you have the ELN attacking people and kidnapping people, some FARC members themselves breaking away. With all of that, would you accept and understand why many Colombians still feel they're not sure if this is worth it and they're not sure if there will be peace with justice?
Of course. I talk to Colombians every day. You know, we are here in the country. We understand that it's very complex to understand what's going on and the commitments that the state had to do in order to disarm the FARC, and all the efforts that the FARC had done in order to put an end to a war that produced more than 8 million victims. But you know, I think what the international community and your audience needs to understand is that the plebiscite was won with an awful amount of lies and the promotion of misunderstandings by a sector of the Colombian political elite that didn't want the deal. And actually the margin which had the no in order to win was a rather small one, and 63% of Colombians didn't go to the polls. They stay at home, they didn't vote, we don't know what they are thinking. And I believe that if you go around walking the streets of different regions of Colombia today, and you see how the impact of the peace deal has had in their lives, most of them, even though they don't agree with 100% of the agreement, most of them, they see a real impact in their lives, and they would support what the FARC and the government are doing.
Understood.
So I think what we will see
let me jump in here for a second. Sure, let me jump in here for a second. Wouldn't it be better to take their concerns seriously rather than saying maybe they were misinformed before the plebiscite? Because in this seat, I've heard it about Brexit. I've heard that people were misinformed. That's why they voted one way or the other. I've heard it with regards voting for Donald Trump or any number of elections. Isn't it better to say, okay, we accept and understand that the majority, by a slim majority, were against this. We have to work hard to win you over, rather than assuming that they were misinformed before the plebiscite?
No, I do believe that we need to have a different way of understanding this. We are entering in an era of post-truth politics, what many people and many scholars are calling it that way. And I think we need to really be a bit more, accurate about the information that is shared to the public. And I believe that Twitter, WhatsApp, and all the social networks have had a serious impact on misinforming people in order to take decisions about their future. So in my view, we really need to make clear that the consensus was that it was a really rather small majority. And of course, the president accepted the majority there and decided to renegotiate with the FARC and to take on board some of the concerns of the no. But overall, there was a very serious misinformation campaign that informed people's decision in terms of the peace process.
Okay, Darrenelle, some FARC members say that they need their weapons because they're being attacked by right-wing paramilitaries and some criminal gangs. Do you believe them?
Well, in order to understand this, the logic of this decision, you have to take into consideration two factors. First is the history of past demobilization processes in Colombia. And if you look at the 1980s, 1990s, and you see efforts of the FARC itself to transition into a political party, you find that there were 5,000 militants from this party who were killed, including 3 presidential candidates and several members of Congress. Hence, it is understanding from behalf of the FARC that they have concerns about their security. Second element is the current context in which the peace process is taking place. This is not a clean-cut peace process between 2 parties. There is, yes, an agreement that has been reached with the FARC, and they're starting the process to demobilize. But at the same time, there are still a big number of armed actors, irregular armed actors, who are still active, who still exercising high levels of violence, and that many of them pose a threat to the FARC. Mm-hmm. So there are legitimate concerns about their safety, and that is what this point of the agreement is trying to do. It's trying to alleviate those concerns, to speak to those concerns, to provide confidence about the will of the government to actually carry on with the agreements.
Right. Now, we're lucky enough to have had someone on the ground among the FARC fighters. Let's bring in TRT World correspondent Annalise Borges, who just spent time in Colombia covering the FARC. Annalise, you were among the fighters, or ex-fighters, if there's going to be a comprehensive peace deal, in one of those 26 demobilization camps. Tell me what it was like and what they told you.
I think one of the most interesting quotes that I heard from this peace process was actually not said there. It was said in Bogota. A professor told me that it was a messy war, so surely enough, it would be a messy peace process. And as your guests have been reflecting, it's been a messy process. The atmosphere in the camp we visited, at least, I can't respond for all the camps, but the camp that we visited, what struck me the most was how relaxed everybody was. People were, of course, they had a long list of complaints, of things that they would like to see change. Of course, this is the first contact the FARC have with the bureaucracy in Colombia. But most of them, or at least every single FARC member that I spoke to, said that they were quite committed to peace. They were ready to do everything in their power to push this process forward, to engage in politics. The reason why most of them had joined the FARC in the first place, and that is, of course, again, according to these fighters. It was actually quite interesting because one of the anecdotes that I have from there is that the very first contact that I had with a FARC fighter was this man approaching me with both of his hands in his belly, saying that that was the price to pay for peace, because they were no longer running away from the army, so they were quite ecstatic, so they were putting on weight.
Brilliant. Andre, you hear that now from analysts on the ground. You're speaking to the FARC fighters, and they're saying they're optimistic about the prospects for peace. But then I spoke to Senator Paloma Valencia very recently, and she was saying the problem isn't so much a peace deal, but is the fact that she and other Colombians feel that people won't be paying the price that they should be paying for the crimes that they committed. How do you actually get that peace with justice when so many people feel there's an injustice at play, Andre?
Well, I think what you are just asking me shows the importance of doing lots of pedagogy in terms of transitional justice. Transitional justice is not an easy process. It's a process that involves, many different actions, not only sending people to prison. And I believe that many Colombians haven't really understood what it means to try to demobilize the FARC and to respect and to honor and satisfy the rights of the victims that are truth, justice, non-repetition, and reparations. And the comprehensive agreement with the FARC, it doesn't just focus on, the people telling the truth, but it focuses also on reparations programs for the victims. And I think that's really, really important. And a negotiation is a deal that you reach with your enemy. You don't actually impose conditions on the other, but you need to reach a middle ground where you actually help manage to move forward. And I think that's what President Santos did. And the main problem with Paloma Valencia and that sector of Colombians is that they are not willing to meet the other sector of Colombian society. We, with Rodeemos el Diálogo, and many members of society have gone to the zonas veredales, to the concentration camps, and have talked to the guerrilla fighters. And as your guest speaker was saying, we found that they are just human beings. They are Colombians that are willing to put an end to the war, and that they are willing to actually help the reparation of the victims and move on. And I think that's the very serious challenge that we are facing at this moment. And probably in the future, they will be a rather small minority.
Okay, interesting point. Annalise, I'm curious, what are their thoughts about what happens next? If there is, complete disarmament, as we expect, and a comprehensive peace process, where do they go? What sort of lives do they lead?
It's very interesting because I put that question to every single person I met at that camp. I said, what are you going to do next? Where are you going to go? Are you going to go back home? And they looked at me very puzzled, because there is no home. The FARC is their home. For many of them, many of the men and women I spoke to grew up in the FARC, had spent most of their life with the group. And they kept saying that what happens to them now is going to be determined by the group, that they are ready to be given whatever job the FARC needs them to do. Most of them are very, very excited about being a part of this political movement, fighting a new battle, this time as a sanctioned political actor. They said most of them don't really have a family to go back to. Some of them are actually scared for their families. They would rather not go back to their families right now, so that their families are not a target of those paramilitary groups. So most of them say they're not going to leave. They are actually not planning on leaving the zonas veredales, these transition camps that are now becoming more and more permanent. And they hope that they can be given a job by the FARC this time in politics.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens to those camps, 26 of them. Darnell, very finally, because I've got a wrap, do you believe that enough of a cross-section of Colombian society, whether right or left or rich or poor or urban or rural, believes in this transitional justice system moving forward?
Well, there is clearly division in Colombian society. The peace process has been a factor of polarization. And indeed, there is, we have to make, all Colombians, I think, an effort to build bridges and to rebuild trust. Trust trust that the former FARC rebels will incorporate and will honor their piece of the deal, trust that the institutions will be able to respond, trust that we can define a future together as Colombians. So while there is a lot of resistance on behalf of some group, and that's something that we need to acknowledge, we have to show how to start a process of delegitimizing those concerns, showing that there is an actual will of peace on behalf of the FARC and also on behalf of the government to do that. And it's all about building trust, reinforcing the confidence in the peace process, preventing dissidents. And actually, in that regard, the peace process has been quite modelic at the moment. Usually in this kind of processes, you expect about 20% dissidents. The dissidents in this case has been about 4%,
yeah, that's a good
which
point.
shows that the FARC are very highly structured.
Yeah, that's a really good
and
point.
And respond to command.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've got to wrap, but yeah, Colombia, could it be on the brink of a proper peace? We'll be watching it very closely. One of the most beautiful things I read about the weapons, once they're handed in, some of the weapons will be melted down to create peace sculptures commemorating more than 50 years of war. That's quite beautiful. Annalise, Darnell, and Andre, thanks so much for joining us. I've got to move on.